Hi, I'm Sherry from Whole Circle Studio, and welcome to the Botanical Beauties Block of the Month and Quilt Sew Along. Today, I'm going to give you some tips as you begin to make your second Botanical Beauties block. In addition to this video, be sure to refer to the tips included in the pattern and other links below to foundation paper piecing video tutorials, as well as last month's video. Much of the content in this video is applicable to all of the Botanical Beauties blocks. Let's get started. As I mentioned last month, depending on your printer, it may be challenging to see the difference in the shading between the flower and the stem. So you may want to make a note on your paper pieces before you start sewing. One example where both the flower and the stem fabrics are used on the same paper piece is piece C for the wreath and piece K for the grid layout. For both, the flower is section 1 and the stem is sections 2 and 3. Pay special attention making notes on these paper pieces, especially if you're not pre-cutting your fabric according to the supplied charts. You will want to make sure that you use the correct fabric in each of these sections. In order to achieve the beautiful irregular and imperfect organic shapes in this month's flower, there are a couple of sections that are pretty tiny. Tiny paper piecing may feel a little bit intimidating, but if you remember, it's just like piecing larger sections, you'll do great. I have some tips and resources for you to make it easier. Pay close attention to the section labels on the paper pieces. You'll notice on paper piece A, used for the wreath layout, and I for the grid layout, there are some tiny little numbers with arrows. So for the section 1, you'll see the arrow. It's actually this little light shaded area. And section 2 has an arrow to this slightly darker little area. Let me show you what this looks like. Even though the fabric pieces in the sections are smaller, you'll paper piece exactly how you did for the larger pieces. So let's go ahead and do this together. I have my fabric for my paper piece 1, or section 1 I should say. I like to go ahead and put a little bit of glue to secure section 1. Again, I'm sure because it's so tiny I'm going past 1. That's okay, it's not a big deal. And again, I'm going to put my fabric so it's facing out. I'm going to hold it up to the light to make sure that it's covered. And then some, and it is. I then like to go ahead and just fold back the paper between 1 and 2, since that's the line I'm going to be sewing on. And I find that it's a little bit easier for the smaller sections, these tiny sections, to just go ahead and trim that extra seam allowance before we get started with section 2. Okay. I'm then going to take my fabric I need for section 2. I'm just going to put it right sides together. And again, this is, if you watch the foundation paper piecing tutorial, this is where I use my X-ray vision. Sometimes I may need a little pencil to sketch where section 2 is. And I know that section 2 is there. I could tell that that orange fabric will cover it in reverse. I can open it up and go ahead and sew. If you're not sure, I know I went through this really quickly. If you did not watch the foundation paper piecing video tutorial, link is below. Check it out. I think this will make more sense. So let me show you what this tiny paper piecing looks like. I'm going to start right on the line. Drop my needle. I have a camera between my face and the machine, so this is a little bit more challenging. But I think I'm close to it. Again, if the camera wasn't there, this would be a little bit faster. Okay, so I can either, I have my stitch length set pretty tight. I'm actually on a 1.4, 1.3. My machine does a stitch in place, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. But if not, I can just do, I'll show you on the next one, a back stitch. The back stitch would probably cover that whole line. And then I only need 1 or 2 stitches. That was 2, and I'll just go in reverse here. So there's a number of stitches. I basically went over the line a few times. I'll cut it. And you can see there, it's cut right on that line, sewn right on that line. I'll then go ahead, let me get that excess seam allowance out of the way. It's not much, but the orange is overlapping a little bit. It's always a good idea to double check. I probably don't need to do this here, but I will, just for best practices. And then I'll go ahead, open this up. You could see it's not super pretty, especially since I have all of the thread cuts. I can always trim that if it bothers me. But sometimes these tiny ones just look like a little bit of a nest. And like I said, you could just kind of trim this. Maybe I'll go ahead and trim it if this bothers you. Carefully. And that's what it looks like. Kind of just a bunch of stitches in place almost. Let me go ahead and press that open. And we'll just go ahead and I'll sew the rest of this piece with you. I can certainly go use my iron for these little pieces. I'll just go ahead and use my seam roller. So let's go ahead and cover section 3, which is right here. We did 1 and 2, these tiny little sections. So we'd be sewing right along this line to connect 3, because we have 1, 2, and then 3. So I'll first go and just fold that back on the line. I'll go ahead and just maybe make a mark. Sometimes you just have to hold it up to a window of where section 3 ends, which is right here in reverse. It goes all the way to the edge of the paper. So I'm going to fold that back, and I want to use this orange fabric to cover section 3. So I'm just going to put them right sides together. And I could see it's a little bit, again, I'm in reverse, want to cover this section. It's a little bit close to this edge, so I'll shift it over. If you're not quite sure sort of about this reverse, be sure to check out my foundation paper piecing video tutorial. The link is below this video to catch up on this part. But I know that from looking at this fabric will cover section 3, so I can go ahead and open it and then sew along that line. So I'm just going in reverse here. This only takes like 2 or 3 stitches to do. So I sewed along that line right there. Open it up, and it does indeed cover. So I'm going to go ahead and trim and press, and then we'll move on to section 4. So section 3 has been trimmed, the seam allowance, and pressed. Let's move on to section 4. So getting out of this tiny paper piecing sections, a little bit bigger. So just as we have been, we'll just finish out this piece. I'm going to fold back between section 1, 2, 3, which is complete, and section 4, because I want to add. I'm going to fold this back. I'm going to go ahead and trim the seam allowance. You're noticing I'm holding my rotary cutter a little bit strange just because the camera is in my way of holding it regular. So do not do that at home. The seam allowance is done. And I want to grab my section 4. So I'm going to use this fabric here, all pre-cut and pre-labeled if you're working that way. Put the fabrics right sides together. This one, again, section 4 goes to here off the paper because I want to just continue the straight line. I can make those marks on the opposite side. And I'll hold it up to some light. See what I can see. Goes that way and off the edge of the paper. So I want to cover that in reverse. So again, right sides together. And again, using my X-ray visions for that whitish fabric, I can see that that will cover. Open it up. You can see that stitch. I started here for 4 and went all the way to the edge of the paper. Flip up to make sure the fabric does indeed cover. And it does. We have a little bit extra, which is okay. And then let's move on to section 5. First I'll trim this, make sure the excess is out of the way. And don't forget to press. And we'll move on to 5. Fold that back. And then 5 is this whole section, so I can kind of visually see that. So fabric, correct sides together. And I could see that that piece will be covered by the orange. So I'll open it up. And I'm going to start at the edge of the paper. It up, make sure it covers. Ta-da, it does. So just don't forget to put it back the way it came off the machine. Flip back the paper, trim any excess if you have any excess in the seam allowance. Press this, and it's all set. It's like mine is a little bit reversed. You could see it's reversed, so the flower is white and the background is orange, but you can see that nice little detail. I know it's ever so slight, but it will be more apparent once the flower is all put together. So this piece is filled. I can go ahead and trim to the edge of the paper. And we're all set. There may be a few angles that you find tricky, like in piece G for the wreath layout and piece O for the grid layout. There's this angle between 1 and 2. If you need some extra help figuring it out, how to piece these angles, be sure to refer to the paper piecing video tutorial. The link is below this video. I also wanted to point out something that I often do for sections that have pretty extreme angles that are at the edge of my paper piece. So this section 1 would be a good example for O. The same thing goes for G. I will often take a pencil and just extend that line. I can also kind of just visualize it, but sometimes in my mind, sometimes it helps to see it as a pencil. So I'll darken this up. So here's section 1, and I'll just extend that line and extend that line. I'll eventually be sewing on that lines. What I like to do is make sure my fabric goes beyond that line. If it doesn't, I sometimes find that I get a little divot in my fabric right on the edge when I'm joining the paper pieces. It's often something that's not a big deal, but I like to have the fabric extend beyond. So to do that, I just make sure when I'm cutting the fabric that it extends beyond sort of these lines there. By here, it's pretty generous. If you're cutting according to the fabric charts, cutting charts in the pattern, I already accounted for this for you. Once I have my paper pieces ready to join, I use a technique called positioning pinning to achieve precise alignments between the pieces. Let me show you how I do this. You'll notice some small dots on some of your paper pieces. These dots are areas where you may want to pay close attention to alignments. For this block, one of the areas is where the flower meets up. Anytime that I have seams that I want to match precisely, this is what I do. Go ahead, and I could see there's a dot here and here. The other side of the flower isn't as critical. It doesn't match up quite as critically. So I'll just match up these two dots. So I'm going to put my pieces right sides together, and I'm going to take a thin pin. Super thin pins are the key to this. The brand that I'm using is an Iris super thin pin. I really love these because they are really thin, but they don't bend easily, which is great. I'll put the link to the brand that I like below this video. So I'm going to start by taking my really thin pin and pushing it right through the dot that I want to align. The first dot on, this is section J. And I could see, sometimes I may need to adjust it a little bit. It comes right up on the seam. And then I'll find the corresponding dot on the other side. And I'll push it through, and I want it right on the seam. Wow, I got it right the first time. That very rarely happens. Usually I need to do this a few times. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this through so that the pin is straight or perpendicular to my paper pieces. I want to make sure it's not slanted like this or like this, because then those 2 points won't be super well aligned. So if the pin, with the pin out straight and my raw edges aligned, I'm then going to take 2 more pins, and I'm going to attach the 2 pieces on either side of that positioning pin. I find that doing 2 pins here on either side of that alignment, or those points that I want aligned, locks it in really, really nicely. So this is what it looks like. I have my 2 pins where I'm attaching the 2 paper pieces together, my positioning pin, and this is really important. Once these 2 pins are in, I want to be sure that I take this positioning pin out. Otherwise it will get caught up on your machine. There's no other dots on this piece that I need to pay close attention to other than the ends. I could just sew like this, but I actually like to, at the ends, just do the same thing with the positioning pin. I find that my block is just much more accurate this way. So again, I'm going to connect the ends and then attach the pieces, especially if I didn't cut the paper quite so carefully. That's not as critical as matching up points and seams. And I'll do the same thing here at this end and to that point. The same would go for the wreath equivalent of these pieces. And then if I wanted to, I could add another maybe extra pin in here just to keep things nice and aligned. Sometimes things shift a little. Sometimes I'll even do the positioning pin to make sure that my seam allowance, that the raw edges are accurately aligned, since I'm going to be sewing on that line, that printed line there. So I have the positioning pin in there now. Again, this might be a little bit, you don't necessarily have to do this. I would only recommend just on those, definitely doing it on the critical points that you want to align. And now I'm ready to sew this on my machine and connect I to J. There may be some pieces that you won't find a dot to match to, like C and D on your wreath version pieces or K and L on the grid equivalent. Here you'll see there's a dot here and here. So I would match those 2 dots using the positioning pinning. Here there's a dot, but here there isn't. So that's not a mistake. If you find that 2 pieces that are meant to go together don't necessarily have a dot on one piece, you'll be using that lone dot as a guide for joining the next piece. So just be on the lookout for where points match. And if there isn't one, just ignore this for now. You'll use that as a guide later when you're joining additional pieces. In the end, if your alignments aren't perfect after you sew these together, and you don't want to use a seam ripper, that's okay. Just remember that botanicals, especially these, are abstract and organic, and I think it fits the theme for the blocks to not be perfectly perfect. I can't wait to see your second block come together. Thanks again for being here and for sewing along with us. I'll be back next month with even more tips. If you have questions or comments or something that you'd like me to show in a future video, please let me know in the comments below. Also, be sure to share your progress on Instagram using the Botanical Beauties hashtags found on the pattern so we can all check out what you're working on. Or I'd love for you to email me and tell me what you're working on. My email address can be found in the pattern. See you next month and happy sewing!